Podcasts. A wrestling show packed with 14 matches held in a casino ballroom with Run DMC performing a rap live for the crowd, and it set a pay-per-view buy record that nobody touched for a full decade. That is WrestleMania 5. Today we are breaking down the event itself, the storytelling that made it a commercial phenomenon, and the wave of audio podcasts that have gone back to pick it apart match by match. By the end of this episode, you will understand why this show's legacy is so genuinely split, what the undercard actually looked like beyond the famous main event, and why podcast hosts are still arguing Team Hogan versus Team Savage more than 30 years later. My co-host has been deep in the research on this one, so let's get right into it.
So the first thing you have to understand about WrestleMania 5 is that the whole event was essentially built around one relationship falling apart.
The Mega Powers.
Exactly. Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage had been this dominant tag team for about a year going into the show. According to TJR Wrestling's review by John Canton, Savage turned heel because he was jealous of how close Hogan was getting to Miss Elizabeth. And that jealousy, that slow burn of a friendship disintegrating, is what drove 767,000 pay-per-view buys in the US and Canada.
Wait, 767,000 buys? That's a massive number for 1989.
It is. And according to TJR Wrestling, that was the largest number WWE did for a WrestleMania until 1999, the Attitude Era, Steve Austin at the top. So it took 10 full years to top it. That tells you everything about how invested fans were in the Hogan-Savage story specifically.
10 years? That's wild. So the emotional hook of the whole show was doing real commercial work.
Real, measurable commercial work. And the event itself, April 2nd, 1989, at the Atlantic City Convention Hall, which was promoted as Trump Plaza. According to Wikipedia, it drew 18,946 people in attendance. Donald Trump was actually sitting ringside.
That's a detail that hits differently depending on when you're hearing it.
Yeah. And the commentary team was Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse Ventura, which by most accounts is a genuinely great pairing. The TJR review specifically calls them a very good pairing. Gorilla opens the show with his classic line, "You can cut the tension with a knife," which, honestly, for a show built on a friendship exploding, is pretty perfect.
Okay, so set the scene a little more. What does the full card actually look like? Because I think a lot of people only know the main event.
So this is where it gets interesting, and also where the mixed reviews come from. According to the official WWE results and Wrestling Epicenter's match-by-match breakdown, WrestleMania 5 had 14 matches total. 14. That is a lot of wrestling for one show.
14 matches? How long was this thing?
TJR Wrestling describes it as nearly 4 hours. So you're getting a lot but the quality is very uneven across those 14 bouts. The show opens with Hercules defeating King Haku, which goes about 6 minutes and 57 seconds according to Wrestling Epicenter. Then you get the Twin Towers, Akeem and Big Boss Man, defeating the Rockers, which is Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, in just over 8 minutes.
Shawn Michaels losing at WrestleMania 5. That's a fun historical footnote.
Right? And then you get a double countout between Brutus Beefcake and Ted DiBiase, which goes 10 minutes and ends in nothing. The Bushwhackers beat the fabulous Rougeaus. Mr. Perfect defeats the Blue Blazer in under 6 minutes. Demolition retains the tag titles in a handicap match against the Powers of Pain and Mr. Fuji.
So the undercard is kind of all over the place.
Very much so. And Wikipedia's retrospective section on the show says exactly that. Criticism was leveled at the amount of matches and their general level of quality. The main event gets praised, but the undercard is genuinely a mixed bag.
So what are the matches that actually hold up? Like beyond the main event, what's worth talking about?
A few stand out. The Brainbusters, Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard, defeating Strikeforce, which is Rick Martel and Tito Santana. That goes 9 minutes and 17 seconds. Then you have Jake Roberts defeating Andre the Giant by disqualification in a match that had Big John Studd as the special guest referee. That one runs almost 10 minutes.
Big John Studd as a special referee is such a specific 1989 energy.
Completely. And then the Intercontinental title match, Rick Rude with Bobby Heenan defeats the Ultimate Warrior to become the new champion. That's a title change. 9 minutes and 36 seconds. According to the PW Torch VIP Roundtable with Wade Keller, Pat McNeil, and Bruce Mitchell, that match gets discussed as one of the more notable undercard moments on the show.
Bobby Heenan is everywhere on this card, by the way.
He really is. The Chat Grapple and Cheap Pops podcast, which did a full review of WrestleMania 5, specifically called out that Bobby Heenan is all over this event. He manages King Haku, he's with the Brainbusters, he's with Andre the Giant, he's with Rick Rude, and then he actually wrestles in a match himself, losing to the Red Rooster in 32 seconds.
32 seconds! Bobby Heenan wrestled and lost in 32 seconds!
32 seconds, yes. According to Wrestling Epicenter's results, and the Brooklyn Brawler was in his corner. It's one of those moments that's kind of absurd and kind of perfect at the same time.
Okay, before we get to the main event, I want to pause on something you mentioned, Run DMC performing at this show, because that feels like it deserves more than a passing mention.
Yeah, so according to Wikipedia, Run DMC performed a WrestleMania rap for the audience at the event. This is 1989. The crossover between hip-hop and professional wrestling at that moment is genuinely fascinating. And the WWF's tagline at the time was, "The World Wrestling Federation, what the world is watching." They were positioning themselves as a mainstream entertainment product, not just a niche sport.
And they were competing with WCW on the same night, right?
Directly. According to Wikipedia, WrestleMania The 5 went head-to-head with World Championship Wrestling's Clash of the Champions 6 television special on April 2nd, 1989. So the two biggest wrestling promotions in the country were fighting for the same audience on the same night, and WrestleMania 5 pulled 767,000 buys. That context makes the number even more impressive.
Okay, the main event. Walk me through it.
So, Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship. Savage is the champion going in. Miss Elizabeth is at ringside in a neutral corner for the first half of the match, and then the referee sends her to the back. According to Wikipedia, Hogan wins with a leg drop after 17 minutes and 54 seconds. Title change.
Nearly 18 minutes. That's a long main event for that era.
It is. And the storytelling in that match, the jealousy, Elizabeth being caught in the middle, the year of build-up, is what every podcast reviewing this show comes back to. The Wrestling Life Support Podcast, which did a 1 hour and 46-minute two-part review of WrestleMania 5, framed their whole discussion around the question, did the year-long Mega Powers narrative generate a satisfying payoff, or did the conclusion of the soap opera leave you mega bored?
That is a great framing question. What did they land on?
The Wrestling Life Support Podcast, hosted by Donnie and Jay, had opinions on it, and they also got into some of the weirder undercard details, like Morton Downey Jr.'s role on Piper's Pit and randomly inserted Jimmy Snuka appearances, which tells you something about how much texture this show has beyond the main event.
Morton Downey Jr. on Piper's Pit. That is a very specific 1989 celebrity cameo.
Very specific. And it's the kind of detail that makes rewatching this show genuinely interesting even now. The Revisiting the Mania podcast on Apple Podcasts, which ran 1 hour and 20 minutes on WrestleMania 5, framed their whole episode around Team Hogan versus Team Savage. Like, whose side are you on? And that question still divides people.
Okay, I have to ask, where do you land on that? Team Hogan or Team Savage?
I think the more interesting argument is actually Team Savage, and here's why. According to TJR Wrestling, Savage turned heel because he was jealous of how close Hogan was getting to Elizabeth. But if you watch the build-up, Savage's paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Hogan was the one who kept inserting himself into their relationship. So the villain of the story is genuinely complicated.
That's actually a really interesting read on it. The heel turn makes more sense when you look at what triggered it.
And that moral ambiguity is part of why the match worked so well and why people are still talking about it. The PW Torch VIP Roundtable, Wade Keller, Pat McNeil, and Bruce Mitchell spent 63 minutes going through the whole show, and the Hogan-Savage dynamic was clearly the centerpiece of that conversation.
Let's talk about the podcast landscape around this show a bit more, because there are actually quite a few different audio reviews out there. What's the range of takes?
So you've got a real spectrum. The PW Torch Roundtable is the most analytical. Keller, McNeil, and Mitchell are wrestling journalists, so they're going deep on the booking decisions, the match quality, the historical context. That's 63 minutes of pretty dense discussion.
And on the other end?
The Chat, Grapple, and Cheap Pops podcast, Chris Dredd and Jordan, also known as JB, take a more fan-first approach. They describe the show as having the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they're pretty upfront that they loved going back and giving their thoughts on the whole thing. It's a warmer, more nostalgic tone.
And then there's Pest Wrestling's History of WrestleMania series.
Right. John Pollock at Pewis Wrestling did a comprehensive history of WrestleMania from 1985 to 2025, and WrestleMania 5 gets its own segment in that. Pollock's approach is to slot each WrestleMania into upper, mid, or bottom tier based on unique facts, records, and best and worst matches. It's a really useful framework for comparing shows across eras.
Where does WrestleMania 5 land in that framework based on what you found?
The search results don't give us Pollock's specific tier placement for WrestleMania 5, but the broader consensus across reviews, TJR Wrestling, Wikipedia's retrospective section, the various podcasts, is that it's a mixed show. The main event is genuinely great, the commercial performance was historic, but 14 matches with uneven quality is a real structural problem.
So it's a show that's bigger than the sum of its parts because of one match and one storyline.
That's exactly it. And the W2M Network's Mania of WrestleMania podcast, Pat Mullen and Mark Radulich, actually traced the full arc from WrestleMania 3 through the first Survivor Series, through the Mega Powers teaming up at SummerSlam 1988, all the way to WrestleMania 5. They treated the whole thing as one long narrative. And when you see it that way, WrestleMania 5 is the payoff of a story that had been building for over a year.
That's actually a really compelling way to think about it. The show isn't just an event, it's a chapter ending.
A chapter ending with 767,000 people paying to watch it, which, again, is the number that doesn't get topped for a decade. That's the Attitude Era, Steve Austin, the most commercially successful period in WWE history, and even then, it took until 1999 to beat what Hogan and Savage did in 1989.
Okay, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the Hart Foundation match, because Bret Hart is on this card, and I feel like that's worth noting.
Yeah. The Hart Foundation, Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart, defeat the Honky Tonk Man and Greg Valentine, who had Jimmy Hart in their corner. That goes 7 minutes and 40 seconds, according to Wrestling Epicenter. It's not a match that gets a ton of attention in retrospective reviews, but Bret Hart being on this card is historically interesting given where his career goes in the next few years.
And Mr. Perfect is on this card too, defeating the Blue Blazer.
Mr. Perfect defeats the Blue Blazer in 5 minutes and 38 seconds. The Blue Blazer was Owen Hart, by the way. So you've got Bret Hart and Owen Hart both on WrestleMania 5, on opposite sides of a match. That's a detail that hits differently in retrospect.
That is a genuinely striking detail. Okay, the Rockin' Robin moment, because TJR Wrestling has some thoughts on the national anthem performance.
So the WWF Women's Champion Rockin' Robin sang America the Beautiful to open the show. And John Canton at TJR Wrestling is pretty direct about it. He says she did not do a very good job and that Jesse Ventura ripped her for it on commentary. Canton's exact words are, as he should. So even the opening of the show is a little rough.
Jesse Ventura critiquing the national anthem performance in real time is very on brand for Jesse Ventura.
Completely on brand. And it's one of those moments that makes the Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse Ventura commentary team so memorable. They had genuine chemistry, and Ventura was willing to say things that nobody else would say.
All right, let's talk about the Jim Duggan and Bad News Brown match, because that one ends in a double disqualification in under 4 minutes, and I feel like that's a very specific kind of WrestleMania moment.
3 minutes and 49 seconds, double DQ, according to Wrestling Epicenter. It's the kind of match that exists on a 14-match card because you need to get everyone on the show, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And that's the structural tension of WrestleMania 5. You have this incredible main event story, and then you have a lot of filler around it.
Which is exactly what the retrospective reviews keep coming back to.
Exactly. Wikipedia's retrospective section says criticism was leveled at the amount of matches and their general level of quality. But here's the counter-argument, and this is where it gets interesting. The show still pulled those record numbers. So maybe the audience didn't care about the undercard quality. They were there for Hogan and Savage.
That's a really important distinction. Commercial success and critical quality are not the same thing.
And that tension is what makes WrestleMania 5 such a rich subject for podcast discussion. The Wrestling Life Support podcast literally asked whether the Mega Powers payoff was satisfying or mega boring. That's the core question. And different reviewers land in different places.
What's the most contrarian take you've seen in the podcast reviews?
The most interesting tension is around the main event itself. Most reviewers praise it, but there's a real question about whether Hogan winning was the right call. Savage was the champion. He was the more interesting character at that point, and Hogan winning essentially reset the status quo. Some reviewers feel the story would have been more compelling if Savage had retained.
Team Savage strikes again.
Team Savage makes a compelling case. And the Revisiting the Mania podcast on Apple Podcasts, which is explicitly framed around that Team Hogan versus Team Savage question, is a good example of how that debate is still alive. They ran an hour and 20 minutes on it and said they'd tell you which matches to watch if you decide to rewatch WrestleMania 5.
That's actually a useful framing for anyone who wants to go back and watch the show. You don't need to sit through all 4 hours.
Right. The main event is essential. The Rick Rude versus Ultimate Warrior Intercontinental title match is worth watching. The Brainbusters versus Strikeforce is solid. Jake Roberts versus Andre the Giant has historical interest. But you can probably skip the Dino Bravo match, which goes 3 minutes and 6 seconds and ends with Bravo winning. That one is not essential viewing.
Dino Bravo in 3 minutes. Got it. So when you step back from all of this, the card, the buy numbers, the podcast reviews, what does WrestleMania 5 actually tell us about how wrestling storytelling works?
It tells us that long-term storytelling is the most powerful commercial tool in wrestling. The Mega Powers angle ran for over a year. The W2M Network podcast traced it all the way back through SummerSlam 1988 and the Survivor Series. By the time Hogan and Savage got to WrestleMania 5, the audience had been emotionally invested for months. That's why 767,000 people paid to watch.
And the undercard quality almost didn't matter because the main event had done all the emotional work.
Almost. The mixed retrospective reviews suggest that the undercard does matter for how the show holds up over time. In 1989, people were buying for Hogan and Savage. But when you go back and watch the full 4 hours now, the 14-match structure is genuinely exhausting. The show's legacy is complicated because of that.
And that complication is exactly why there are so many podcasts still reviewing it.
Exactly. A show that's universally great doesn't generate as much debate. WrestleMania 5 generates debate because it's genuinely split, one of the best main events in WrestleMania history, surrounded by a lot of filler. That's a more interesting conversation than a show that's just good all the way through.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. WrestleMania 5 is a masterclass in one specific thing and a cautionary tale in another.
Say more.
The masterclass is long-term storytelling. A year of build-up, a friendship turning into a rivalry, a woman caught in the middle, that's what drove 767,000 buys and a record that held for 10 years. The cautionary tale is card construction. 14 matches in 4 hours means a lot of those matches are just taking up space.
That's a really clean way to put it. And it's the tension that every podcast reviewing this show is navigating. The PW Torch Roundtable, the Wrestling Life Support Podcast, the Revisiting the Mania crew, Chat Grapple, and Cheap Pops, they're all wrestling with the same question. Does the main event redeem the undercard, or does the undercard drag down the show?
And the answer seems to be it depends on what you're measuring.
If you're measuring commercial impact, WrestleMania 5 is one of the most successful events in wrestling history. If you're measuring match quality across the full card, it's genuinely mixed. Both things are true at the same time.
And that's what makes it worth revisiting and worth listening to people argue about.
The fact that the Team Hogan versus Team Savage debate is still alive in 2023, the Revisiting the Mania podcast published their episode in August of that year, tells you that the emotional core of WrestleMania 5 hasn't faded. People still have a side.
All right, here's the thing that's going to stick with me from this conversation. A show that happened in 1989 in a casino ballroom in Atlantic City with Run DMC performing a rap and Bobby Heenan losing a match in 32 seconds. That show set a pay-per-view record that nobody broke for 10 years. And the reason is simple. People cared about two guys who used to be friends. That's it. That's the whole formula.
And every podcast that's gone back to review WrestleMania 5, whether it's 63 minutes from the PW Torch team or an hour and 46 from Wrestling Life Support, is really just trying to understand how that formula worked and whether it actually paid off the way it should have.
So the next time someone tells you wrestling is just fake fighting, you can tell them that in 1989, a fake friendship breaking up generated a record that stood for a decade. That's not nothing. That's storytelling at its most effective.
April 1st, 1990. Two good guys walk into a wrestling ring, both holding championship titles, and the entire rulebook of professional wrestling gets thrown out the window. No villain, no clear person to root against, just two of the most popular wrestlers on the planet colliding for everything. Today, we're diving deep into WrestleMania 6, specifically what made it so historically different, why the main event was unlike anything the WWF had ever done before, and what the wrestling podcast world has been saying about it decades later. Joining me is someone who has been deep in the weeds on this one, and I want to start right here. How do you even book a show like this?
So that's the thing that makes WrestleMania 6 genuinely fascinating. The WWF at that point had a very clear formula. You have your hero, you have your villain, and the hero overcomes the odds. But for WrestleMania 6, they threw that formula completely out.
Right, and it worked.
It worked enormously. According to the retro review on 411 Mania by Robert Lighty Jr., WrestleMania 6 drew 560,000 PPV buys. And here's the kicker. That was the last WrestleMania to break 500,000 buys until WrestleMania 14. So we're talking about a show that set a commercial benchmark that held for years.
Wait, so WrestleMania 6 outperformed every WrestleMania between it and WrestleMania 14 in terms of pay-per-view buys?
That's what the 411 Mania review notes, yeah. And when you think about what was driving that number, it really comes down to one thing. Nobody knew who was going to win. Hogan almost never lost. So how could he lose here? But Warrior was the fastest rising star in the company. So you had this genuine uncertainty that was commercially electric.
Let's back up and set the scene properly because I think the context of where this show happened matters a lot. Walk me through the basics.
So WrestleMania 6 took place on April 1st, 1990 at the Sky Dome in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And that location alone is historic. According to Wikipedia, it was the first WrestleMania ever held outside of the United States.
The first one outside the US. That's a big deal.
Huge deal. And the Sky Dome itself was basically brand new. According to TJR Wrestling's review by John Canton, the Sky Dome had only opened during the 1989 baseball season, so WrestleMania 6 was one of the very first major events ever held there. The building was a massive attraction, partly because of its retractable roof.
So they're bringing the biggest show in wrestling to a brand new stadium in a foreign country. That's a bold move.
Very bold. And the crowd showed up. The announced attendance was 67,678 people, which, according to Wikipedia, was a record for the Sky Dome at the time. And by all accounts, that crowd was loud the entire night.
Okay, so you've got a record-breaking crowd, a brand new venue, a country that had never hosted WrestleMania before. What was the energy like going into the main event?
The TJR Wrestling review captures it really well. John Canton writes that the opening montage had Vince McMahon doing a voiceover saying the most powerful forces in the universe were going to collide. And then you had Jesse Ventura on commentary doing his signature line, quote, "I've been to the Super Bowl, I've been to the World Series, I've been to the Rolling Stones, and one event surpasses them all, WrestleMania."
Jesse Ventura was just built for that moment.
He really was. And he and Gorilla Monsoon were the announce team for the 4th WrestleMania in a row at that point, according to the TJR review. So there was this real sense of continuity and familiarity on commentary, even as everything else about the show was breaking new ground.
Here's something I want to dig into, the actual build to the main event. How did Hogan versus Warrior even get made?
So according to Wikipedia, it started at the 1990 Royal Rumble. Hogan and Warrior crossed paths in the match, and a week later, on February 3rd, Hogan put forth what he called the ultimate challenge to Warrior. He wanted to know whether Hulkamania or the power of Warrior was the strongest force in the WWF.
And then they made it a title versus title match on top of that.
Right. On February 10th, WWF President Jack Tunney officially announced the match. And then on February 24th, Tunney announced that both Hogan's WWF Championship and Warrior's Intercontinental Championship would be on the line. Winner takes all. According to Wikipedia, that made it the first WrestleMania main event that was both a babyface versus babyface match and a title versus title match.
So two firsts stacked on top of each other. First time two good guys headlined WrestleMania, and first time both titles were on the line.
Exactly. And that combination is what made the stakes feel so real. You couldn't predict the outcome using the normal wrestling logic of the era. The TJR review puts it perfectly. People thought Warrior could beat Hogan, but you had to pay to watch it to find out. That uncertainty was the engine driving everything.
And here's what's wild to me. The Win Twice Wrestling podcast, which did a full review of this show as part of their March Through the Manias series, framed it as this question of how the WWF would transition into a new decade with a new face-painted champion. So even the podcasters revisiting it decades later are treating it as a genuine turning point.
That's the right framing. Because what WrestleMania 6 really is, when you strip it back, is a passing of the torch. Hogan had been the face of the WWF since the mid-80s. Warrior was the next guy. And the show was the moment that transition happened in front of 67,000 people.
Let's talk about the undercard for a second, because I think it gets overlooked. What else was on this show?
So, the undercard had some genuinely interesting stuff. According to Wikipedia, the Tag Team Championship picture involved the Colossal Connection. That was Haku and Andre the Giant, managed by Bobby Heenan. They had won the belts from Demolition back on December 13th, 1989, and were defending them at WrestleMania 6.
Andre the Giant as a tag team champion. That's a wild image.
It really is. And the 411 Mania Retro Review by Robert Lighty Jr. opens with the opener, Coco Beware versus Rick Martel, the model. He notes that the crowd was popping for everything, which tells you something about the energy in that building from the very first match.
The Parts Unknown Wrestling podcast, which did a full WrestleMania 6 review as episode 32 of their series, highlighted a few specific undercard moments too. Jake Roberts doing a magnetic promo, and they gave a lot of love to Mean Gene Okerlund and Gorilla Monsoon.
Mean Gene is so underrated in the history of that era. He was the connective tissue of so many of those shows. And Gorilla Monsoon on commentary, the TJR review notes, he and Jesse Ventura had been the announce team together since WrestleMania 1. So by WrestleMania 6, they had this real chemistry that elevated everything.
Okay, here's a tangent I have to go on for a second. The Sky Dome itself. Because the TJR review mentions that it's now called Rogers Center, but a lot of people still call it Sky Dome. And the 411 Mania review mentions that Robert Lighty Jr. as a kid was just completely awed by the giant video board inside the building.
Yeah, and that tracks. The Sky Dome was genuinely futuristic for 1990. It had only opened the year before. The retractable roof was this massive engineering feat, and the scale of the place was unlike anything most wrestling fans had ever seen. So even before the first match, the venue itself was part of the spectacle.
And there's this incredible detail in the TJR review. A young Adam Copeland, who would later become Edge, was actually in the crowd that night. And there's apparently a shot of him captured in the True Story of WrestleMania DVD.
Which is such a perfect detail. A future WWE Hall of Famer sitting in the crowd watching the show that would define the era he'd eventually become a star in. It's one of those things that makes wrestling history feel genuinely layered.
Okay, let's get into the podcast landscape around this event, because that's a big part of what we're here to talk about. How has the wrestling podcast world engaged with WrestleMania 6?
So there are multiple shows that have gone deep on this. The Parts Unknown Wrestling podcast did their WrestleMania 6 review as episode 32 of their series, and they framed it around the Ultimate Challenge while also digging into some of the more complicated undercard moments. The Win Twice Wrestling podcast covered it as episode 20 of their March Through the Manias series.
And then there's the North-South Connections Chronoso series.
Right. Chronoso episode 41 from the North-South Connection podcast network, which dropped in February 2025, focused specifically on WrestleMania 6. Their whole format is one match, one voice per month, going through every important match in WWE PPV and television history. So they're treating the Hogan vs. Warrior match as one of the essential matches in that canon.
Which it clearly is. I mean, WWE themselves ranked it as number 15 on their greatest WrestleMania matches ever list, according to the YouTube upload of the full match.
Number 15 out of every WrestleMania match ever. That's a significant placement. And the full match video on WWE's YouTube channel has racked up 1.3 million views, which tells you the appetite for this content is still very much there.
So what is it about this specific event that keeps pulling podcasters and reviewers back to it?
I think it's the combination of firsts. First WrestleMania outside the US, first babyface versus babyface main event, first winner-takes-all title match at WrestleMania. Any one of those would make it historically significant. All three together make it genuinely singular.
And the TJR Wrestling Review by John Canton really leans into that. He calls it very historic right at the top of the piece. And he frames the Warrior win as something that felt fresh. He writes that he wanted Warrior to win because it would be something fresh, even though he didn't expect Hogan to actually lose.
That's the emotional core of the whole event, right? The surprise. Hogan almost never lost. So when Warrior actually won, it landed with this enormous weight. The crowd had been loud all night, but that moment must have been something else entirely.
And the 411 Mania Review notes that Robert Goulet sang "Oh Canada" at the start of the show, which is such a specific, wonderful detail. You're in Toronto, you open with "Oh Canada," and then you spend the next several hours watching the biggest show in wrestling.
It's a real moment of the WWF acknowledging where they were. They weren't in Madison Square Garden or a US arena. They were guests in Canada, and they leaned into it.
Let me push back on something slightly, because I think there's a counter-argument worth making. Some people look at WrestleMania 6 and say the undercard is thin, that outside the main event, it's not a particularly strong show. Is that fair?
It's a fair critique. The The 411 Mania review is pretty honest about the show's limitations, and the Parts Unknown podcast noted some of the more uncomfortable undercard moments. But here's the thing. WrestleMania shows from that era were never really about the undercard in the same way modern shows are. The main event was the product. Everything else was context.
And the main event delivered enough to carry the whole show's legacy.
Clearly, you don't get 560,000 PPV buys, a record Sky Doom attendance, and decades of podcast reviews if the main event doesn't deliver. The Hogan vs. Warrior match did exactly what it needed to do.
Here's something I find genuinely interesting about the podcast landscape around this event. The Win Twice Wrestling podcast framed their review around this question. How would the Federation transition into a new decade with a new face-painted champion? And that framing is really smart because it positions WrestleMania 6 not just as an event, but as a pivot point.
It's the right way to think about it. The 1980s WWF was Hulk Hogan. Full stop. WrestleMania 6 was the moment the company tried to say, okay, what does the 1990s WWF look like? And the answer they gave was Ultimate Warrior holding both titles.
Which, didn't quite work out the way they planned in the long run.
Right, and that's part of what makes WrestleMania 6 so interesting to revisit. It's a moment that felt like a definitive answer to a question, but history complicated that answer pretty quickly. So when podcasters go back to it, they're not just reviewing a wrestling show, they're examining a decision point.
The North-South Connections Chronoso series is doing something really specific with this, right? They're going match by match through WWE history. So for them, WrestleMania 6 isn't just a show, it's a single chapter in a much longer story.
Exactly. And their format, one voice per match, 1 month at a time, forces a kind of depth that a broader review might not achieve. When you're spending an entire episode on one match, you have to really interrogate what made it work, what the context was, what it meant for what came after.
And the TJR Wrestling Review by John Canton is doing something similar in written form. He's not just recapping the matches, he's placing them in the context of his own experience watching the show as a kid, and then reassessing them as an adult.
That dual perspective is really valuable, because WrestleMania 6 hits differently depending on when you first saw it. If you were a kid in 1990, it was this genuinely shocking moment. If you're coming to it now, you're watching it with the knowledge of everything that came after.
The 411 Mania review actually touches on this directly. Robert Lighty Jr. mentions that he reviewed this show back in 2008 and then came back to it in 2024, and his whole approach to reviewing had changed in the intervening years. He talks about focusing on the positives rather than trying to be edgy about what didn't work.
Which is a really honest thing to say about how your relationship with wrestling content evolves. And it speaks to why WrestleMania 6 keeps getting reviewed. It's not just about the show itself, it's about what the show means to you at different points in your life.
Let's talk about the announce team one more time, because I think Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse Ventura deserve more credit than they usually get for how they shaped the feel of these early WrestleManias.
The TJR review notes they were the announce team for the 4th WrestleMania in a row at WrestleMania 6. And Jesse's whole character on commentary, he was the heel commentator, always rooting for the bad guys, always challenging Gorilla's more straightforward takes, gave the broadcast this real tension. Even when there wasn't a villain in the ring, Jesse could create that dynamic from the commentary booth.
So in a show where there's no villain in the main event, Jesse Ventura becomes the villain of the broadcast.
That's a really good way to put it. And the Parts Unknown podcast gave a lot of love to both Gorilla Monsoon and Mean Gene Okerlund in their WrestleMania 6 review, which tracks those two were the voice and the face of that era of WWF television.
Okay, so let's zoom out and think about what WrestleMania 6 represents in the broader history of the event. Because we've been talking about all these firsts. First outside the US, first babyface versus babyface main event, first winner takes all. But what does it mean for WrestleMania as a concept?
WrestleMania had been running since 1985. By 1990, it was 5 years old and had established a very clear identity. WrestleMania 6 is the moment the show proved it could evolve. It could go to a new country, it could break its own storytelling rules, and it could still deliver commercially and creatively.
And the 560,000 PPV buys are the proof of that.
Hard to argue with that number. And the fact that it held as a benchmark until WrestleMania 14, which was the Steve Austin era, a completely different commercial moment for the company, tells you how significant WrestleMania 6 was in its time.
I want to come back to something the Win Twice Wrestling podcast highlighted. The idea of the face-painted champion. Because Ultimate Warrior's whole presentation was so different from Hogan. Hogan was this all-American hero, Warrior was this almost otherworldly, chaotic energy. What did that shift mean?
It meant the WWF was betting that audiences could connect with a champion who didn't fit the traditional mold. Warrior wasn't giving you the 3 demandments or telling you to say your prayers and take your vitamins. He was doing these intense, barely coherent promos about the power of the Warrior. It was a completely different register.
And the crowd at WrestleMania 6 was clearly ready for it.
The 411 Mania review notes the crowd was popping for everything from the very first match. So by the time the main event hit, that building was primed. And when Warrior won, it wasn't just a title change, it was a genuine emotional moment for 67,000 people.
Here's a question I keep coming back to. Why does this show specifically keep generating podcast content? Like, there are 40 plus WrestleManias now. Why does WrestleMania 6 keep pulling people back?
I think it's because it's genuinely unresolved in a way that most WrestleManias aren't. The show raised a question, can the WWF move past Hogan? And then history gave a complicated answer. So every time someone reviews it, they're not just looking at what happened on April 1st, 1990. They're looking at what it meant and whether the bet paid off.
And the podcast format is actually really well suited to that kind of retrospective analysis. You can sit with the complexity in a way that a quick written recap can't.
Exactly. The Chronoso format from the North-South Connection is a perfect example. 1 match, 1 episode, 1 month. That's a commitment to depth that forces you to really think about what you're reviewing rather than just summarizing it.
And the Parts Unknown podcast, which has been going through every WrestleMania in order, treats WrestleMania 6 as a genuine landmark in that journey. Episode 32 of their series, sandwiched between WrestleMania 5 and WrestleMania 7.
And when you're doing that kind of sequential review, WrestleMania 6 stands out because it's the moment the whole trajectory of the series shifts. Before it, Hogan is the constant. After it, everything is up for grabs.
So, when you step back from all of this, the attendance record, the PPV buys, the firsts, the podcast reviews, what does WrestleMania 6 actually come down to?
It comes down to a single question that nobody could answer before April 1st, 1990. What happens when you put 2 heroes against each other and make them both fight for everything? And the answer WrestleMania 6 gave was, you get one of the most commercially successful and emotionally resonant shows in the history of the business.
And the fact that wrestling podcasters are still sitting down to review it, debate it, and dig into it, from the Win Twice Wrestling podcast to Parts Unknown to the North-South Connection, tells you that the question it raised still hasn't been fully settled.
That's the mark of a genuinely great event. Not that it answered every question, but that it kept generating new ones.
A wrestling show so radioactive that it couldn't fill its original 100,000-seat venue, and the company quietly moved it to a much smaller arena and hoped nobody would notice. Today, we're digging into WrestleMania 7, the 1991 pay-per-view that tried to turn the Gulf War into a wrestling storyline. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why this show is so polarizing, what actually happened on the card beyond the controversy, and why the podcast world keeps coming back to it decades later. And to help break all of that down, I've got someone who's gone deep on this one.
March 24, 1991, Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena. And that location already tells you something went wrong before a single match happened.
Right, because it wasn't supposed to be there.
Not even close. According to Wikipedia, WrestleMania 7 was originally scheduled for the LA Memorial Coliseum, the same venue where the Los Angeles Raiders used to play. That place holds around 100,000 people. The WWF's official reason for moving it was security concerns tied to Sergeant Slaughter's character, who was portraying an Iraqi sympathizer during the Gulf War.
But that wasn't the whole story.
No, and this is where it gets interesting. Slam. Sports of Canada at the time chalked the venue change up to poor ticket sales. The WWF was struggling to fill those 100,000 seats. And according to former WWF executive Bruce Pritchard, on his Something to Wrestle With podcast, both explanations were actually true. He said even if they had sold out the Coliseum, the scope of the event was too large for police to guarantee security.
So it was a genuine security concern and a ticket sales problem at the same time.
Exactly. And that dual reality kind of defines the whole show. The attendance on the night was 16,158, according to Wikipedia. You go from planning for 100,000 to getting 16,000. That's a significant gap.
And all of that traces back to the main event storyline, Sergeant Slaughter as an Iraqi sympathizer.
Yeah, and this is where the show gets genuinely complicated. The WWF built the entire event around Hulk Hogan challenging Sergeant Slaughter for the WWF Championship. Slaughter had turned his back on America to support Iraq. This was during active US involvement in the Gulf War. The tagline for the whole event was Superstars and Stripes Forever.
Which, I mean, that's a very specific cultural moment to try to capitalize on.
Very specific. And Sean Mooney, who was actually the WWF's backstage interviewer at the time, talked about this on his primetime podcast. He described it as a time when patriotism was, quote, top shelf. Everybody was into being part of the country and standing up. But he also said the timing of the event got dicey. It was two sides of a conflict, and that made people uncomfortable.
Mooney actually has a whole episode on Apple Podcasts specifically about the Hogan versus Slaughter feud. It's called WWE WrestleMania 7's Most Controversial Feud. He describes it as one of the most heated and dramatic feuds in WWE history.
Right, and he's not wrong about the heat. The Maze of Media retrospective review put it pretty bluntly. They said the WWF attempted to capitalize on the real-world tension of the Iraq War, and that led to a mixed reception and a notable impact on ticket sales. That's the exploitation argument, and it's hard to dismiss.
So before we even get to the matches, the show is already carrying all of this weight.
And the broadcast itself leaned all the way into the patriotic theme. According to Wrestling Epicenter, the show opened with Willie Nelson performing the national anthem. Willie Nelson, at WrestleMania.
That is such a specific choice.
And then Hacksaw Jim Duggan was dressed as Uncle Sam to do commentary on the opening match, because Bobby Heenan's team was involved in that match, and he couldn't be objective. So you had Uncle Sam on commentary. That's the vibe.
Okay, so let's actually get into the card, because I think this is where the show gets more interesting than the controversy suggests. 14 matches on the broadcast, right?
14 matches shown during the live broadcast, plus one dark match before the event, according to Wikipedia. That is a lot of wrestling. The TJR Wrestling Review by John Canton noted this was a 4-hour WrestleMania, and he pointed out the PPVs moved to a more standard 3-hour format after this one.
4 hours is a commitment.
It is. But here's the thing. Buried inside those 4 hours are some genuinely significant moments. The show opened with the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, defeating Haku and the Barbarian. The TJR review noted the Rockers got a huge pop. They were way more popular at this WrestleMania than they had been at the two previous ones.
And then you get the Nasty Boys winning the tag titles from the Hart Foundation.
Which is actually a bigger deal than it sounds. According to Wikipedia, that was the final televised match of the original Hart Foundation. After that night, Bret Hart became primarily a singles wrestler. So you're watching the end of one era and the beginning of another, and most people in the building probably didn't fully realize it.
That's a genuinely significant moment that gets completely overshadowed.
And it keeps happening on this card. The blindfold match between Jake Roberts and Rick Martel, that ran 8.5 minutes according to Wrestling Epicenter. The Maze of Media called it a spectacle of psychological warfare. Two guys in hoods, completely unable to see, trying to find each other in the ring. It's bizarre, but it works.
Okay, but the match everyone talks about from this show, Warrior versus Savage.
The retirement match. Ultimate Warrior versus Randy Macho King Savage with Queen Shari in his corner. That went 20 minutes and 48 seconds, according to Wrestling Epicenter. And Wikipedia describes it as leading to Savage's reunion with his estranged lover, Miss Elizabeth, which became one of the most emotionally resonant moments in WWF history.
The Wrestling Retrospective podcast actually dedicated 4 separate episodes to WrestleMania 7. They covered it in parts. And one of those episodes specifically discussed, quote, the beats of a man's life. That's clearly a reference to the Savage storyline.
Yeah, and that's the thing about this show. It has enough material to sustain 4 podcast episodes.
The Chronoso podcast on the North-South Connection Network did a deep dive into the WWF Superstars and Stripes for 1991 television special, which was the major promotional centerpiece leading into WrestleMania 7. They described it as one of the most important and emotionally charged broadcasts of WWE's golden era. And that special included the contract signing between Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage.
Right, Chronoso described it as filled with tension, symbolism, and career-defining stakes. So by the time you get to the actual match at WrestleMania 7, there's a whole architecture of storytelling behind it.
And then there's the other moment from this show that nobody can stop talking about. The Undertaker's debut.
His WrestleMania debut, specifically. According to Wikipedia, The Undertaker defeated Superfly Jimmy Snuka at WrestleMania 7, and that was the beginning of his renowned WrestleMania winning streak. Wrestling Epicenter has the match at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. It was short, but it was the first step of something that would define the next 2 decades of WrestleMania.
So you have the start of The Undertaker's streak, the effective end of the Hart Foundation as a tag team, the Warrior Savage retirement match, and all of it is sitting underneath this enormous cloud of controversy about the main event. That's exactly the tension that makes this show so interesting to revisit. Scott and Paul's Rambling podcast put it really well in their September 2025 episode. They said they were trying to determine if WrestleMania 7 is worth remembering for more than just the real-world controversy surrounding it. That's the central question. And what's the answer? Is it?
I think the honest answer is yes, but with a significant asterisk. The controversy is real, and it's not nothing. The Maze of Media retrospective was pretty direct about the WWF exploiting the Iraq War for storyline purposes. That's a legitimate criticism, but the undercard has genuine historical weight.
The fan community is pretty split on this too. There's a Reddit thread on the Wrastlin subreddit where one user argues WrestleMania 7 was stacked with good stories, colorful characters, and banging entrance music. They specifically call out the Warrior Savage retirement match, The Undertaker's first WrestleMania win, the blindfold match, and Hogan versus Slaughter.
And the top reply to that post is just no, not even top 10.
Which is kind of the perfect encapsulation of how divided people are on this show.
It really is. And Post Wrestling's John Pollock, who did a comprehensive History of WrestleMania special covering every show from 1985 to 2025, actually slots each WrestleMania into upper, mid, or bottom tier. WrestleMania 7 is in there, and the fact that it gets its own dedicated segment in a 2.5-hour retrospective tells you it's not being dismissed.
Let's talk about the main event itself for a second, because Hogan versus Slaughter ran over 20 minutes.
20 minutes and 26 seconds, according to Wrestling Epicenter. And Hogan won the WWF Championship. That was a title change. So, the show ended with Hulkamania reclaiming the belt, which is exactly the patriotic payoff the WWF was building toward. Sean Mooney's Apple Podcasts episode described it as cementing Hulkamania's dominance once again.
But the controversy around Slaughter's character, did that actually hurt the show's reception at the time?
The Maze of Media retrospective says yes, they describe a mixed reception and a notable impact on ticket sales. And we already talked about the venue change from the Coliseum to the sports arena. So the answer seems to be that the character generated heat, but maybe not the kind the WWF wanted. It made some people uncomfortable enough to not buy tickets.
There's a difference between heat that sells tickets and heat that keeps people away.
Exactly. And that's a lesson the wrestling business has had to learn more than once. When you tie your storylines too tightly to real-world geopolitical events, you're taking on a risk that goes beyond whether the match is good.
What about the Legion of Doom match? Because that's another one that gets mentioned.
The Legion of Doom, Animal and Hawk defeated Power and Glory, Hercules and Paul Roma in 59 seconds. According to Wrestling Epicenter, that's under a minute. It was essentially a squash match, but the crowd reaction for LOD was massive. They were one of the most over acts in wrestling at that point.
Under a minute. That's almost a statement in itself.
It is. And then you had the Intercontinental title match, Big Boss Man versus Mr. Perfect, which went nearly 11 minutes and ended in a disqualification. So, Mr. Perfect retained the title by DQ. That's a finish that frustrated a lot of people.
The podcast community has really latched on to WrestleMania 7 as a subject. You've got Scott and Paul's Rambling podcast, the Wrestling Retrospective doing 4 episodes, Sean Mooney doing multiple episodes from an insider perspective, Chronoso doing the build-up special. Why does this particular show generate so much audio content?
I think it's because the show is genuinely unresolved in people's minds. It's not a clean legacy. You can't just say it was great or it was terrible. It's both, depending on which part of the card you're looking at. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes for good podcast conversation.
The Wrestling Retrospective podcast episode descriptions are kind of fascinating in that way. One episode talks about flag burning and upside-down titles and flag etiquette. Another talks about the beginning of the most enduring gimmick of all time. That's The Undertaker.
And another episode mentions seeing the biggest merchandise mark of all time, which is almost certainly a reference to Hulk Hogan. The show is dense with these moments that each deserve their own conversation.
There's also the Virgil versus Ted DiBiase match, which had its own storyline going on.
Virgil, with Roddy Piper in his corner, defeated Ted DiBiase by count out. That ran 7 minutes and 41 seconds. It was the payoff to Virgil finally standing up to his employer DiBiase Another storyline with real emotional stakes that got buried under everything else happening that night.
And Genichiro Tenryu and Koji Kitao defeating Demolition. That's an unusual match for a WrestleMania.
Very unusual. Two Japanese wrestlers defeating one of the WWF's established tag teams. It ran under 5 minutes. It's one of those matches that feels like it belongs to a different show entirely.
So when you step back from all of this, the controversy, the undercard gems, the podcast landscape around it, what does WrestleMania 7 actually represent?
It represents a specific kind of risk that the WWF took and partially paid for. They tried to make wrestling feel urgent by connecting it to a real war, and that created genuine discomfort. But in the process of building that show, they also produced The Undertaker's first WrestleMania win, the emotional peak of the Warrior Savage feud, and the quiet end of the Hart Foundation. Those things happened because the show existed.
It's almost like the controversy was the price of admission for some genuinely important wrestling history.
That's a good way to put it. And the podcast community has recognized that. You don't spend 4 episodes on a show that has nothing to say. The Wrestling Retrospective podcast, Scott and Paul, Sean Mooney, Chronoso, they're all finding different angles into the same event because the event is genuinely layered.
Sean Mooney's perspective is particularly interesting because he was actually there. He was conducting the backstage interviews on the night. Wrestling Epicenter's results listing mentions him interviewing the Rockers before their match. So when he talks about the behind-the-scenes decisions, he's not speculating.
Right, and his primetime podcast episode is described as revealing behind-the-scenes stories that WWE fans have debated for decades. The biggest booking choices, the real reasons certain matches and creative calls happened the way they did. That's primary source material for wrestling history.
And Bruce Pritchard's Something to Wrestle With podcast is another one that touched on this, specifically the venue change decision.
Which is a perfect example of how wrestling podcasts have changed the way fans understand history. Things that were just rumors or speculation for years, like why WrestleMania 7 moved venues, now have actual answers from the people who were in the room.
Here's what I keep coming back to, though. The show had 14 matches. 14. And the one that gets the most scrutiny is the main event, which is also the one most tied to a real-world event that made people uncomfortable.
And that's the trap of booking around real-world events. The Gulf War ended, the urgency of the Hogan Slaughter storyline evaporated, but the Undertaker streak, that lasted until WrestleMania 30. The Warrior Savage match, still talked about as one of the great retirement matches in wrestling history. The things that were built on pure storytelling aged better than the thing built on geopolitics.
That's actually a really sharp observation. The shelf life of a storyline tied to a real conflict is limited by how long that conflict stays in the cultural conversation.
Exactly. And WrestleMania 7 is the clearest example of that in WWF history. The main event feels dated in a way that the undercard doesn't.
So here's the question I want to end on. If you're someone who's never watched WrestleMania 7, should you?
Yes, but go in with context. Know what the Gulf War was, know what the Sergeant Slaughter character was doing, and understand why the venue change happened. If you watch it cold, the main event is going to feel strange. But if you understand the moment it was made in, the whole show becomes a fascinating document of what wrestling was willing to do in 1991.
And the podcast landscape around it is genuinely helpful for that context. Scott and Paul's Rambling podcast, the Wrestling Retrospectives 4-part series, Sean Mooney's Insider episodes, there's a whole ecosystem of audio content that can walk you through it. And Pios Wrestling's John Pollock has it in his comprehensive WrestleMania history special, which covers every show from 1985 to 2025. So you can see where WrestleMania 7 sits in the broader context of the event's history, not just in isolation. So, when you step back from everything we've
WrestleMania 8, April 5, 1992, Hoosier Dome, Indianapolis, Indiana. *** was a landmark event for WWF, often remembered as the end of the Hulkamania era and a bridge to the new generation. It featured a unique * double main event * structure, drew a reported attendance of around 62,167, and had a strong buy rate. The card had highs, 2 excellent title matches, but also notable lows, a poor main event and some filler. Many retrospectives call it a solid to very good show ### Key matches and card highlights: Shawn Michaels, with sensational Sherry, def. Tito Santana, El Matador, ***, solid opener that helped establish Michaels as a singles star. **The Undertaker, with Paul Bearer, def. Jake the Snake, Roberts **, short but effective. Highlighted Taker's dominance and Roberts' character work. Bret Hitman Hart def. Rowdy Roddy Piper, C***, for the *WWF Intercontinental Championship *, one of the best matches on the card. A stiff, hard-hitting affair blending technical wrestling and brawling with a great finish. Widely praised by critics. *8-man tag *, Jim Duggan, Sergeant Slaughter, Virgil and Big Boss Man def. The Mountie, Repo Man and the Nasty Boys, fun, chaotic undercard tag with comedy and brawling. Tatanka def. Rick Martel *, decent midcard match. Money Inc. C. vs. The Natural Disasters WWF Tag Team Championship, ended in a countout or double DQ, not a standout. Randy Macho Man Savage, with Miss Elizabeth def. Ric Flair, C. with Mr. Perfect, ***, for the *WWF Championship *, the emotional and in-ring highlight. Excellent storytelling with Flair's mind games, Savage's intensity, and a classic big match feel. Many consider this one of the best WM matches of the era and argue it should have closed the show. Main event *, Hulk Hogan def. Sid Justice with Harvey Whippleman by disqualification. Papa Shango's late interference led to a chaotic, poorly received ending. This was seen as Hogan's final stand at the time, but it was a major letdown compared to the rest of the show. ## overall reception. Critics and fans generally praise the * Piper vs. Hart * and especially * Flair vs. Savage * matches as standouts. The undercard has some enjoyable moments. But the show drops off significantly after the Savage-Flair bout. The Hogan-Sid main event is frequently ranked among the worst WrestleMania main events. Dave Meltzer ratings, from Wrestling Observer, were mixed, with the main event getting negative stars due to the botched finish. Consensus fan, critic scores * often land around * 7, 10 *, a memorable show with strong historical significance and 2 all-time title matches, but dragged down by the main event and some padding. ## historical context and legacy. This event marked the transition from the larger-than-life 1980s stars, Hogan, Savage, Piper, to younger talents like Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and The Undertaker. It was also notable for bringing in Ric Flair from WCW NWA. The double main event format was experimental, and while the Savage-Flair match delivered, the Hogan bout didn't. Recommendation *. Watch the full show for nostalgia and context, but if you're short on time, prioritize * Bret vs. Piper * and * Savage vs. Flair. It's a fun snapshot of early 90s WWF with great character work and in-ring psychology in the key bouts. Many wrestling fans call it unfairly underrated overall. If you want a deeper dive into specific matches, video links, or comparisons to other manias, let me know.